Thank you all for coming. My name is Baruch Labinsky, and I'm going to be presenting today to you how to transition your finances to Israel. So just before I start, everybody, maybe just raise your hand if you're in the beginning stages of Aliyah and it's going to be another couple years. How many are in that front? How many are closer to actually making Aliyah? It'll be in the next, let's say, 6 months. Okay, so kind of split. Okay, so we're going to be talking about both. And we're going to be talking about a lot of issues that you will face after making Aliyah as well. Okay, so this is the basic topics that we're going to go through. We're going to go through some pre-Aliyah financial issues, understanding a little bit more about the cost of living in Israel, some retirement planning, asset management, housing, and insurance, and some other estate planning. We're going to go through a lot of topics really quickly. I'm not here to, unfortunately, because we have a limited time, I'm not going to be here to answer every one of your questions in this session, but we're going to be here the rest of the afternoon so we can answer all your individual questions in person as well. Okay, so as I mentioned, my name is Baruch Labinsky, and I have been in Israel since 1993, originally from Canada. I've been working in the financial field in Israel for over 30 years. I'm a licensed financial planner and investment manager in Israel. And we manage money both in Israel and in the United States. Thank God we have been merited to be associated with Nefesh now for almost 20 years. And we've traveled around and spoken to hundreds and thousands of people over the years to help them transition. And I hope to be able to help you as well today. Okay, before you're making Aliyah, I know I've already heard from a number of people. What do I need to be thinking about, right? There's so much to be planning from a technical perspective, but there's also the same in terms of your finances. You have to start by creating your own individual checklist, your own individual issue list, right? That will be personalized for your situation. Right? Because everybody's situation is different. Somebody might come and own a home in Israel already. Somebody might own a home here and have to deal with selling or not, right? Somebody might have employment issues that they have to worry about. What are they going to be working in Israel? And others come when you're already retired. So personalize it to your individual circumstance. Okay, we'll go through all of these different areas. Okay, the plan that we're going to be talking about initially is the first year. Right? What do we need to be thinking about in our first year? It's critical that you have a cash flow plan. I hear this often that people come and they don't know how much money you need to save. Well, you know, when somebody asks me, well, how much money do I need to save in order to make Aliyah? So the answer generally is, how long is a piece of string? Right? It depends. It depends on your situation. It depends on where you're going to be living. It depends on whether you're going to have a job. Are you going to be spending time learning the language? Or are you going to be transitioning back and forth? You're going to be going and spending 6 months of the year there and 6 months of the year here in the United States. What is your individual circumstance? So you have to look at the plan, your individual plan, and start putting it together. Where are you going to be living off of? What are you going to be living off of over that first year? Do you have savings? Are you going to be earning money, right? What are all of the impacts, right? Am I going to be renting a place? Do I have an existing home that I'm going to be living in? Start putting together all of the different pieces. So the first year is very critical, okay, because everything is going to be new. A lot of times what I'll recommend to people to do is to take very, very close, keep close track of your finances in the first year. Why? Because there's a lot of money that's going to be flowing through your hands. You're going to be transitioning. You're going to be selling your house potentially. You're going to be moving. You might be bringing a lift to Israel, bringing over things. So you have to settle in a new house, new apartment. You might have to furnish that apartment. You might have to start putting your kids in school. There's so many different things that are going on, and so many of them are actually unique to your initial transition. So you have to track things to get an idea of long-term how it's going to work for you in Israel, right? Because the first year could be very, very different than the rest of the year. So keep track of your income, keep track of your expenses over that period of time, so that you can understand what's a unique expense and what is a kind of standard expense. Okay, that you can then build your budget and decide what you can afford to do when you're actually settled there long term. Okay, the main areas that your budget is going to change when you make Aliyah, right? For the better, for a lot of people, at least education and healthcare costs are significantly cheaper in Israel, right? Medicine, socialized medicine in Israel, and you can get by with a very, very small expense compared to the privatized medicine here in the United States. Education also is significantly cheaper in Israel, especially if you're sending your children to private schools, or for that matter, even higher education. University is much, much, much cheaper in Israel than it is in the United States. However, there are also a number of different areas that are much more expensive as well. So housing, again, depends on where you're living. It might be more expensive than it is here in the United States, again, but it will depend on neighborhood and city and state. And then there's a whole bunch of other, the normal everyday transportation, right? Food, taxes that are generally higher in Israel than they are in the United States. Okay, the biggest initial question that most Olim face is, what do I do with my home? So if I own a home in the United States before I make Aliyah, do I sell or do I not? Right? So why would I want to sell? So I think the biggest factor in terms of why you would want to sell is just actually not a financial issue. It's more of a psychological issue. You want to sell because if you're really making Aliyah and you're going to be living in Israel, having a home to come back to and psychologically knowing that I can bail out at any point in time actually can have a very negative impact. So if you really want to make Aliyah and you really want to make it work, getting rid of your home, selling your home and saying, no, I'm really going to be there is a very, very strong reason to sell. Managing a property from abroad, if you're going to keep your home and you're going to rent it out, can be very time consuming and stressful, right? It's hard enough to rent out a property when you're close by and you can jump over there. But if you're already like thousands of miles away and you can't actively manage it, and you can't find necessarily a renter, and you have to deal with, selling it at some point in time, it's much easier to do those things prior to making Aliyah when you're here and you understand the market and you understand what's happening in the community, right? So that's another reason why, again, it's going to cost money to do that. Many times you'll find a manager, so that's going to cost you, right? And there's a residency issue. What does that mean? That means that if you are continuing to keep your home here in the United States, you might be deemed a resident for tax purposes in the state that you were living in before you made Aliyah. And that could cause you, under certain circumstances, to pay higher taxes. So that's another reason to sell. And then, of course, the other major reason that most people sell is because they can't afford to have a house over here and a house in Israel. So they sell in order to get the capital from your house here in the United States and move it over there to buy something in Israel. Okay, reasons not to sell. So the opposite of the psychology of owning. So a lot of times people want a fallback option. If you're not 100% convinced that you're making Aliyah and you want to try things out, so it might be a good idea to keep your house because you want to be able to transition back into your community, into your home, okay? And source of income, right? If you want to rent out, and if the rent to value ratio of your home here in the United States is higher than what you could expect in Israel. So that might be another reason to hold on to your property. Generally, as a rule of thumb, in Israel, it's relatively cheap to rent. Okay, there's something that's called the rent to value ratio. That means how much rent you're going to pay on a yearly basis in order to rent something as a percentage of the total value. So in Israel, you're going to pay somewhere in the range of between 2 to 4% of the value of your property to rent. that sound expensive or does that sound cheap? Cheap. It is. Compared to here in the United States, you might find the rent to value ratio in most communities in the United States is between 8 to 12%. So if you're holding a property here and you can get 10% on the value of your property, so it might make sense for you to rent it out and gain that 10%, and then rent over there and only pay 2.5% of the value of the property. And then you don't have to necessarily sell. Okay, what do Israelis pay on average compared to other Western countries? Anybody have a guess in terms of, do we have a higher standard or a higher cost of living, or is it cheaper? From experience?
Higher.
More. In general, it is higher. These are a lot of the major areas here. Not all of them, right? But you see transportation, cars definitely are much more expensive in Israel. But it's not just cars. I think in general, restaurants, food, clothing, furniture, all of those general consumer goods are generally more expensive in Israel. But you weigh that out with those two major expenses that I mentioned earlier, healthcare and education, which are much cheaper in Israel. So again, you have to look through your individual circumstance and put together a budget, right? So these are 4 different examples of budgets. We're not going to go through them in any depth at all. In fact, anyone who wants to get a hold of this presentation, you can just send us an email or sign up for the mailing list, and we'll send out the presentation. The main thing to take out of this is that you have to personalize your budget to your individual circumstance. Okay, that is really the critical thing, because everybody's situation is different. If you're living in Metula versus if you're living in Yerushalayim or in Tel Aviv or in Beersheba, and if you're living in a home versus in a small apartment, and if you're working and you're earning a decent salary versus if you're just living off of your Social Security, your budget is going to be tremendously different. So personalize it to your individual circumstance. Okay, a lot of times people make jokes about Israel, and they say, right, the famous joke that you've probably heard about 100 times, right? How do you make $1 million in Israel? Come with a couple $1 million, okay? So I want to tell you that that's not true. It's just simply false. There is a tremendous amount of wealth in Israel. Wealth from people who are bringing it, yes, but also wealth that is being created in Israel by average, everyday Israelis, okay? But there are 2 different types of economies, right? You notice here, right, that the wages were up in December, right? That's good. That means it's a strong economy. That means that the unemployment rate is at an all-time low in Israel. But, right, the average overall wage is only about 14,500 shekels. That's pre-tax. Okay, but in the high-tech sector, it's more than double. And I would put in the high-tech sector not just technology, but also professionals and business owners, entrepreneurs in Israel have done very, very well, right? That's like they have its own kind of class, right, of people who have been very, very successful in building wealth in Israel through owning businesses. And so you have to look at what your individual circumstance is. Are you coming to work in a regular job? Are you coming with an education, with a profession? Are you coming to open up a business? Are you going to continue to work here in the United States? These are all questions that you have to be thinking about when putting together your plan. Okay, if you're going to be a salaried employee, so you have to understand the Israeli benefits, employment benefits. Okay, Israelis have a major advantage, which is that there's a mandatory pension law, which is putting aside for the average Israeli between 20 and 30% of their gross salary into long-term retirement savings. It's a lot of money, right? What's the savings rate here in the United States as an average? Yeah, it's generally, it depends on, it varies, but it's in the single digits for the most part, right? Well, in Israel, it's much higher, and that's largely because between 20 to 30% of your salary goes towards savings. Okay, so you have to understand what's available to you. And when you negotiate a job, and so you have to know what else is there and what are the types of benefits. Okay, these are examples of different retirement plans there. Right, a Keren Ishtalmut is an advanced savings plan, which is probably the best tax benefit that in Israel, because it's both tax-free on the way in and on the way out. And the third one is the Keren Ishtalmut there that I mentioned. That's the one that the average employer, I would say the majority of employers are putting up to 10%, 2.5% from the employee, 7.5% from the employer. So you have 10% of your salaries going in tax-free to long-term savings. That's tremendous. If you have 30% of your salary going long-term, that's one of the reasons why Israelis have been able to get by over the long run, because they are putting aside so much money towards those long-term savings. If you're not working in a standard job, and instead you're either working here, you're continuing to work abroad, or if you have a job there, but part of your work is abroad, or if you have a business and you're keeping a business, so then it's going to be very, very important that you get advice about how to structure your income. It's well beyond the scope of what we can talk about now, but structuring your income is very, very critical. Talk to financial tax professionals, because that will be a really, really important part of that. Okay, let's talk a little bit about retirement. Okay, what is retirement to you? Right? What is it going to look like? There are a lot of different phases of retirement. Are you going to be fully retired in Israel and you're going to be there the whole year, 12 months of the year? Are you going to be moving back and forth, commuting, spending 6 months over here and 6 months over there? Are you going to be traveling, vacationing? Are you going to continue working? Do you have to support your kids? Do you have to support your family, your parents? Right? You have to look at what retirement means to you when you put together your retirement plan. And then once you know what retirement is going to look like for you, so then you can start to actually put together all the different pieces, like where your income's coming from. How much am I relying on Social Security or my retirement accounts? What about any continued employment, investments? Right? All of those things are going to be on the revenue side. And then you have to look at what it's going to be costing you to live in Israel. And then you can take into account all of those factors as well, like rent and travel and potentially supporting and just ongoing living expenses. Okay. Just because you spent X here in the United States does not mean that you have to spend X in Israel. You have a certain opportunity now to kind of start from scratch, to kind of set the clock, again. And you can really determine from the very beginning what your standard of life is going to look like over there. And I know many, many people who have transitioned their finances to Israel and really are living in they're living in a very comfortable, but a different type of budget and a different type of standard of living than they lived over here. And that's because your life is going to be different. Think about it. Where are you going to be living? If you're living in the center of Jerusalem, you might not need a car. While here, you might have 2 cars or 3 cars, right? So personalize the plan and see how it's going to work for you, given your circumstance and given what you're projecting your lifestyle to be like over there in Israel. Okay, let's talk a little bit about asset management. Okay, so as I mentioned, right, Israel actually has been, over the decades, a great place for people to invest their money. Okay, it's got a developed stock exchange, the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, right? Huge presence of Israeli companies on the NASDAQ, a lot of high tech, a lot of venture capital that has come into Israel especially over the last decade. Right? Everybody's probably heard about the real estate market, right? How prices have come up. Obviously, for the people that are living there, it's much better because they have been in the market and saw the increase in prices. But it's been a great place to invest your money in the Israeli market. Okay, when you're thinking about making Aliyah, one of the most important questions that people will ask is, what do I do with my assets? Do I keep my assets here in my home country, or do I transition them to Israel? Okay, so I'm going to give you some of the reasons why you should be considering bringing some of your money to Israel. So first of all, when you're making Aliyah, you have currency risk if you keep all of your assets in dollars. Now, I know it might not sound, so strange to think that your assets are in dollars, because right now you're spending dollars. You're living in a country which is completely dollar-based, right? The average American portfolio, even if they have international diversification, might have 10 to 15% internationally diversified. Okay, but in Israel, you're not now going to be exposed 100% to the dollar. You're going to be living in a completely different financial environment. The analogy that I like to give to people is that if you were living here and you went to your financial planner and they told you that I have a great idea for you, I think that we should take your money and invest it in Japan. Why Japan? Because I think Japan is a great country and it's got a nice upside. The stock market hasn't been doing well for many years, and now it's started to really come up. And I think it's going to be a great idea to have your money in Japan. Okay. Now, even if you would agree with your financial planner, your investment manager, and say that the idea makes sense, I don't think that there are very many people who will take 100% of your money and move it over there into Japan, into yen. Now, why? Why wouldn't you do that? Why wouldn't you? If you thought it was a great idea, why would I not move all my money over there into yen? Because you're not diversified. But it's not even just because you're not diversified. It's because you living here in dollars, right, are exposed to what's happening in the dollar world. Right? If you're living in Japan, they're making decisions about investments, about currency, about inflation, how to control inflation, debt numbers, right? All those are things that they're making decisions for their local population. In fact, right, they are even potentially controlling currency and the ability to move money in and out of a country. So while in the United States, we don't have currency controls, and we don't have the ability, we're not limited in terms of our ability to move money in or out. We have no idea what's really going to happen in the long run with the US dollar or with the US economy. And the decisions that are being made over here are made for US citizens. We're seeing this really be played out right now as we're speaking, in the days and the weeks that we've seen in the past with all the tariff discussions, right? Tariffs are a form of protectionism, right? And they are meant to protect American jobs, and it's going to have an impact on the American dollar and the strength. So if you're living there in Israel and you only have dollar exposure, so then what you're doing is you're tying yourself to a foreign country, which is now America, because you're not living there anymore. And so not only just because of the currency, because we don't know what's going to happen with the dollar in the long run, right? And you should all know that, I'll show you a chart in a few minutes, that the Israeli shekel has been the strongest Western currency over the last 20 plus years in the world. Okay, it's actually appreciated against the dollar. While the dollar is appreciated against most currencies worldwide, the shekel has actually appreciated over the last 20 plus years. Okay, it's a major inflation hedge to have money in shekels. Why? Because if there's all of a sudden high inflation in Israel and you have your money in shekels, you can invest it and have it linked to the inflation rate. But if you're tying it to the dollar and all of a sudden, the dollar, devalues, you're not going to be linked to that currency. Okay, we talked about the diversification, country risk, right? Most people, when they're investing with their general investment portfolio, whether it's in the US or Canada or the UK or Germany, have the largest amount of their portfolio in their local currency. And there's a good reason for that, because they want accessibility, because they want to have exposure to the local economy and to the companies that they're investing in. And yes, I know the United States is the largest economy in the world. And yes, we've lived through a period of time, especially in the last decade, where the American market has outperformed almost all other Western markets in the world. but there is something that's called reversion to mean. And we don't know what's going to be in the future. And so when you're transitioning, you want to think about moving money to Israel. Now, I'm not telling you, and please don't go out and say, oh, I said everybody should move all their money to Israel. No, but you have to ask the question. You have to think about where it is appropriate for you to have your money. And especially if you're creating a plan where you are accessing and you're living off of dollars because you can't move your money to Israel. So what's an example? So what's an example of a source of income that you can't move to Israel? Pension, I heard here, right? Social security, right? You can't move that to Israel. You can't move your social security. I mean, yes, you can deposit it to Israel in shekels, into your Israeli bank account in shekels. It'll get converted for you automatically and deposited in your bank. But you can't take away the currency risk because it's going to be paid to you in dollars every month. Same thing with your retirement accounts. Now you can take out money from your retirement accounts in a lump sum and bring it into income and pay taxes on it, but most people don't do that. Most people will continue to slowly draw down their retirement savings because you don't want to take in too much of that into income in any one year, because then it'll increase your tax exposure. So instead, right, you're going to have dollar exposure. So if you have a high amount of dollar exposure in retirement accounts or Social Security, so then you might want to look at some of your other assets being invested in shekels. If it's the opposite, let's say you're coming to Israel when you're younger and you're working and you're going to be saving money in shekels because you have retirement accounts that are being opened up and contributed to, like I mentioned, like that 20 to 30% that's being contributed in shekels, even though it's not all shekel exposure, because a lot of the Israeli pensions also invest in international and dollar-based investments. But if you have more of an Israeli exposure with your income, so then you might want to keep more of your assets in dollars. Okay, so you really have to personalize it. Okay, we'll talk a little bit later about administration as well. Okay. The Tel Aviv market versus the US indexes. So I wanted to just kind of show you, because I'm sure people will tell you, the American market has been doing great. And it has been. And if you compare the American market versus the Israeli market over the last half a dozen years or so, so you'll see that the NASDAQ and the S&P have done substantially better than the Israeli Tel Aviv 125 index. So this is the story in the last half a dozen years. But if you take it back even further, looking over the last 25 years, so the top line there is the NASDAQ, the middle line is the Tel Aviv 125, and then there's the S&P there. So the Israeli market over long periods of time has actually done very well, has been very competitive to the American indexes. And the American indexes have pretty much outperformed almost all other worldwide developed market indexes. So it shows you how well the Israeli market has done over that period of time. This one shows just the Tel Aviv 125 versus the S&P. Okay, not bad, again, for a developing country that has been living through, I don't know, half a dozen wars over this period of time between, 2000 to 2025, right? Even last year, right? How many people were hearing that the Israeli economy was terrible last year, or that there were like all these issues? Why? Because we were fighting a war on 7 fronts, right? What was happening in the economy? Does anybody know the details of actually what was happening in the economy in Israel last year? Inflation wasn't actually bad at all. Inflation was like in the high 3s, high to mid 3s. Yes, they had a large deficit because they needed to, right, in order to afford the war. But employment was at an all-time, right, high. Unemployment, right, all-time lows. The stock market, right? Who has heard of this? That you have a developed market, stock market index, right? Where you're in a war for literally the entire year, okay? And the market went up by 28% last year. Okay, unprecedented. And even when they're reducing our sovereign credit rating, right? A lot of that is political. There's a tremendous amount of amazing things happening in Israel and in the financial system, and it's reflected in the market. Okay, this takes a look at just if you want to understand in terms of the valuations, right? The S&P 500 price to earnings ratio, and you see where we are right now. This is current earnings, right, in the high 20s. Shows a little bit about like what the market is. And in Israel, so Israel, this is the Tel Aviv versus some of the other world indexes. But comparatively, the point is here that Israel hasn't even seen in the last number of years the same run-up that the American markets have, but yet over long run has done fine, and it has a lot of upside. Again, this was the credit rating that I was mentioning to you before as well, that how even though Israel has been downgraded over the last year, right, it has still been able to manage its debt. It has been able to raise money. It's oversubscribed by investors. There's a lot of stability. You know, I don't know if anybody knows this, but like I think it was like now it's 2 or 3 years ago that the Israeli government was able to raise money in one of the bonds that they issued for 100 years. They issued a 100-year bond. That means that they were raising money from investors, from institutions, with only a promise to pay that back in 100 years. Think of what that means. That means that there are a lot of investors out there that have confidence in the Israeli government, the Israeli economy, and their ability to pay back their debt. Okay, this looks at what the dollar has done over the last, last 25 years. The height, it was over 4.8. And over the last 20 years, basically, it has been in one direction, pretty much going down. Now, again, there's going to be lots of spikes, lots of volatility. Yes, that's the reality in general with currencies. You never know exactly when the currency is going to be strong. And if anybody tells you that they know exactly what's happening with their currency, you know, in another month or 6 months or even next week. So my experience is run away, because nobody really knows exactly what's going to happen with currency. But the way you should be looking at it is just understanding that there's going to be fluctuations, and that it's good to have diversification. It's good to have some money. You might need to bring larger sums of money there at the beginning in order to buy something, buy an apartment, buy a home. If you're not buying a home and you don't need large sums of money initially, so then you might want to plan to just bring money slowly over a larger period of time. Something like more like cost averaging, where you, let's say you might bring over money every 3 months or every 6 months, so that you're taking advantage over the currency changes over a longer period of time. And there will be opportunities, as you see, the spikes, it goes up and down every 6 months, every year, every 2 years, right? There are going to be opportunities to bring over money when the rates are a little bit higher. What you don't want to do is don't want to put yourself in a situation where you have to bring over money and then be forced to convert it. Again, if that's what you're living off of, and then you don't have a choice. You live off the dollars that you have, and you have to convert them with whatever they are being converted at that moment in time. But long term, got to be patient and try to find the right time without panicking. Okay, any questions up till now? Please.
Curious if you have any suggestions in terms of low-cost investing options. Let's call it the Schwab-like approach that would be available in Israel.
Okay, so there are brokerage houses in Israel who are similar, let's say, call it to the Schwab low fee based investing, where you can, in general, it'll be a little bit more expensive to invest in Israel than it will over here. In Israel, they haven't yet gotten rid of all transaction costs like they have here in the United States. And by the way, for anyone who thinks that they're not paying anything over here in the United States to trade, so talk to me after. You're paying. You just don't know where you're paying because it's a hidden cost. Okay, but in Israel, it's transparent. You're going to pay a fee for buying and selling, and there's actually something that's called a custodian fee, where you also will pay a custodian fee to the broker or the bank that's holding your assets. So in Israel, just like in the United States, there are low-cost options, ETFs, exchange traded funds, right? And there are, cash, money market type funds. You can buy short-term government bonds. All of those are options in Israel. However, okay, something that you'll see later on in one of the other slides, there's a little bit of a restriction. It's not a legal restriction, but it is a restriction in the sense that Americans have a major problem with investing outside of the United States in passive foreign investment corporations. Okay, if you've never heard that term, you will probably hear it if you are looking to invest outside of the United States. It's called a PFIC, Passive Foreign Investment Corporation. And that means that anything that is structured as a fund, as a passive fund. So if you went into a mutual fund or a ETF, an exchange traded funds, those are a passive investment structure. And if you were investing in those outside of the United States, you're going to be taxed prohibitively in the United States for that type of asset. Not because that's what was really being targeted when they came up with this legislation many decades ago. They were going after other people, but it actually means that you are also included under that net. So if you would invest in an ETF, you'll have to pay taxes at your marginal tax rate as regular income. You'll have to have a deemed sale every year, and you'll have to file a special tax return. All of those are very prohibitive. So the way that we invest for our clients and Americans is that we put together individual portfolios of bonds and stocks, and then you avoid the whole PFIC issue. But there are same ability to do what you're doing here in Schwab as you do over there.
With the pension or savings plans, right, that are tax, enhanced in Israel, I imagine that those have options that they won't allow you to pick individual stocks or
You're worried about, you're saying about the PFIC issue because of
issues.
Yeah.
And
So generally, and you can talk to some of the accountants here, but if it's a employer-sponsored retirement account, it's considered to be in a different status, and therefore it's not given the same PFIC status that you have, because you don't have access to the money on a yearly basis. So it's considered to be a different thing.
it's individually owned versus, so.
It doesn't even have to.
1K versus an individually owned brokerage account if you were going to translate it for American.
Yeah, but you don't even need it to be. You can have an individually managed, like for some retirement accounts, you can also do that in Israel, but you don't even have to do that. You can invest in standard Karen Pensias, Vito Oppenalin policies. Those are retirement accounts in Israel, and it doesn't enter the PFIC issue. Did you have a question over here? No? Who was there?
If you live in Israel permanently and don't have a U.S. address, are there issues involved with maintaining either pension accounts in the U.S. or taxable accounts in the U.S.?
Okay, so pension accounts, you generally will not have an issue, okay, because you can't really move it. They can't force you to move it, okay? However, financial institutions in the United States, a large number of them, have decided, not from legal reasons, but because of more bureaucratic administrative reasons, not to support foreign-based Americans. So it depends on the institution. You can find institutions that will have no problem holding your regularly taxed, investment accounts in the United States and your retirement savings, and you will have other institutions who will not feel comfortable, although they won't be able to close retirement accounts, but they might restrict your trading. And the biggest issue really becomes the products that you're holding. As a non-resident, you can no longer buy mutual funds in the United States.
You hold them?
You can hold them, but you can't transact in them. That means you cannot sell. You might be able to sell them, but then they won't let you buy them.
What about ETF?
Because ETFs are not a problem, because those are stocks. Those are traded like stocks. They're regulated as like a stock, as opposed to a mutual fund, which is regulated on a state basis. And if you're not a resident in that state, so then you can't buy those anymore. Yes.
If you transfer your dollars to shekel and you make investments in Israel, what are the tax implications in terms of reporting to the?
If you are selling your investments here in the United States, whatever gains you have on that, you'll have to report at that point in time.
But don't you have to report your foreign investments?
So when you set up an account in Israel, so there's something that's called, again, it'll be on a later slide that we'll get through in a few minutes, but it's called an FBAR, a foreign bank account report. So you'll have to report that anytime you have more than $10,000 in a foreign account, you'll have to report on it in an FBAR.
So then
In
are you paying
addition to that,
taxes?
no, we're not talking about the taxes. In addition to that, so you also have a requirement to report in the United States gains that you have on your international securities. So if you have gains in Israel, so you'll first pay taxes in Israel. And then if there's any additional taxes that are due in the United States, which are usually, it's not the case, meaning if Israel's tax rates are generally higher. So if there are taxes due in Israel, so then you'll just get a credit for taxes paid in Israel, and then you'll use that on your American tax return. Okay, let me go on, and then we'll come back to some more questions at the end. Okay, renting versus buying. Okay, we talked a little bit about selling your place, so you're going to also have a similar issue with regards to whether to buy versus to rent. As I mentioned, the rent to value ratio in Israel is low. You're only going to be paying 2.5% to 4% of the value of your property to rent. So many people will decide to rent, and I generally will recommend, especially for Olim, that you rent to start with, not just because it's a financially smart decision, but also because you don't necessarily know where you want to be unless you've spent tremendous times in Israel and you know exactly the neighborhood, or you have family that you're going to and you know you want to be in a certain area, right? Unless you have that as a background. So then take the time, rent. Maybe you might travel a little bit and find different communities that you want to live in, right? Take the time and rent. Renting is a very, very good option in Israel. Okay, as you see here, this is an index of what's happened with value of real estate in Israel. In the last number of years, it's even gone up much higher. Very, very comparable to some of the most expensive real estate here in the United States even, right? And it's a disadvantage for people. But what I tell people all the time is that just because the value of real estate has gone up in Israel, and you might not be able to afford exactly what you owned over here, doesn't mean, first of all, that you can't afford something. Doesn't mean that you might not be able to afford something outside of the major centers where things are considerably cheaper. And it also doesn't mean that you can't come to Israel and rent long-term, because there are a lot of people who do that as well. Okay, this chart just looks a little bit in terms of like what the stock market has done versus the real estate market. A lot of times we hear the Israeli real estate market has done amazing and the prices have like gone up. And if you talk to the average Israeli actually invests mostly in the real estate market. Or there's a lot of people who will think of putting money in the real estate market because they see that as being something that has gone up consistently. If you look statistically, though, the Israeli market has done better than the stock market has done better than the Israeli real estate market over long periods of time. And these are like looking at the charts for 5, 10, 15, and 20-year periods of time, you know, the average over this entire period. Again, it's just look, another one just looking at the cumulative gains. Okay, let's talk a little bit about banking and what you need to be thinking about before you make Aliyah. Definitely you have to make sure that your financial institution knows that you're making Aliyah, because you might be transferring large amounts, you might be accessing money, you might be spending money, large amounts of money outside of the country, and you'll be flagged if you don't tell them in advance. Okay, you have to understand how you transfer money when you're outside of the country. I have clients that has happened to, I believe, more than one who have had to travel back to their home country in order to authorize a transfer of money because they didn't have it in place before they left. That's why another reason why you might consider to appoint a power of attorney, a POA, here in the United States before you leave to help you with that inevitable bank issue that will come up or could come up. And just because you solve all the issues right now, you just also have to be aware that things change because they also change the regulations. And so it could be that you were 100% set up before you left, and then all of a sudden the bank changes the regulations and says, now we won't authorize a transfer abroad of more than $100,000 unless you come into the branch. For instance, I'm not saying that that's, but you could have a situation like that. So that's why you might want to think about a POA, having somebody who's going to be locally here, able to help you with those financial transactions. Okay, make sure you have an ATM card that works in Israel that can take your money from your bank here. Right, cancel unnecessary credit cards. What do you need to have, 10 or 15 different credit cards, especially if you're not going to be using those and spending your money over here. Make sure your online banking is working, right? Make sure you know how to get on, make sure it works over there and it functions well. And apply for a Social Security login before you make Aliyah. Because once you're out of the country, you will not be able to access it. That doesn't mean you lose your Social Security. It just means you won't have a login to be able to get information about your Social Security when you're in Israel. You have to get that here in the United States.
Login won't work.
The login will work, but if you didn't have a login when you made Aliyah, you can't apply when you're over there. You'll have to come over here and be in the United States in order to apply for a login.
Any value in transferring your credit history?
There is no ability to transfer your credit history to Israel. Israel has its own credit bureau, right? And you'll have to a certain degree, start from scratch. Now, that doesn't mean always 100% from scratch. If you come in and you need to get a mortgage, let's say you're buying something within the first year and you don't have a long credit history. So you can bring your tax return. You can bring your information that you've had for years over here, and that will help you. But it's not like building your own credit record, and they won't transfer your credit record.
Are there any American banks that are particularly friendly to do business with Israel or that have branches in Israel?
Commercial branches, no. There are no American branches, banks that have like commercial branches. There are Citibank, I believe, has like offices there in Tel Aviv, but it's mostly used for commercial. There's some investment houses I can tell you that are very unfriendly to Israel, but I'll tell you all that offline. Okay, tax planning. So there's going to be another session on tax planning, so I'm really not going to go into it. We talked a little bit about FBARs and PFIX, the dual taxation. You want to try to avoid dual taxation, obviously. And there is a 10-year tax holiday. Don't think that that's for all of your income. It's only foreign-based income that you have a 10-year tax holiday in Israel. That means if you're working in Israel, you're going to pay taxes in Israel, right? There isn't a universal reporting requirement in Israel. That means you do not have to file a tax return necessarily. If you're working in a job, or if you have within the first 10 years, let's say if your income is coming from outside the country, you will not have to file taxes in Israel. Taxes will be taken off at source by your employer or by the investment house before they give you your profit. Okay, it's a different tax system, but it's not just a different tax system. You have to think about Israel is a completely different financial system. And you really can't think that I'm just going over to the next state or even to the next Western country. Like Canada and US have a lot of similarities with regards to their financial system. Israel really is a completely different country. So you have to approach it like that. Okay, estate planning. Israel does not have an inheritance tax. That's great. Makes it easier. But if you have trusts in place or if you have things set up here in the United States, you're going to want to reevaluate all those things before you make Aliyah. Okay. If you have a will, you will likely need to rewrite your will when you come to Israel. Because Israel has a couple different legal systems. It has religious court systems and it has the secular court systems. And you want to make sure that your will is actually going to be compliant for Israeli law and not just American law. Okay, and something else to think about in terms of is insurance. Again, it's just part of one of those issues that you're going to be facing. You're going to have insurance policies. Do I keep my insurance policies? Obviously, things for For property, you're not gonna need, if you're not keeping your property here, but your life insurance, health insurance, disability insurance policies, if you are thinking of keeping them, make sure they are going to be valid in Israel. Too many people come and pay policies and then try to make a claim and realize that they are not valid overseas.
Question, I know this doesn't talk more about insurance, but is there some sort of long-term care insurance?
There is long-term care insurance in Israel. It has become very, very expensive. And there have been periods of time, there is a couple of insurance people here that you can talk to about it, but it's been up and down in terms of like what has been available. You have to, just from a financial perspective, long-term care is much cheaper in Israel than it is here in the United States. Okay, so there are more options there at reasonable rates. And I would also say it's the model of long-term care in Israel is much more also home-based, family-based, in-house, assistance people, right? It's much more common than it is here in the United States. Okay, I'll finish off with just a few quick tips. As I mentioned, Israel is a completely different financial system. So don't go in thinking, oh, I'm just going to act exactly the way I acted here in the United States. And that's why I tell you that it's critical to negotiate everything in Israel. Okay, everything in Israel is negotiable. That doesn't mean you're going to win on every negotiation, but everything is negotiable. That means if you walk into a supermarket, you can technically negotiate with the cashier, okay, for a certain product, or the butcher, or going into the bank, when your insurance and professionals and the whole gamut, you can negotiate in Israel. Doesn't mean you're going to be successful, but just know that if you never, if you never ask for a discount, that you're leaving a certain amount of money just on the table. And it can be something as simple as just, can I have a discount? I'm an Oleh Chadash, right? Please. That's enough, because people build into their pricing systems that they start at a certain level because you're living in the Middle East. You're living in a shuk, in the marketplace type of thing, where they start over here because they know that everybody's going to be negotiating them down to here. And if you walk in and you pay this, you're leaving money on the table. So everything is negotiable. Okay, what's a guardian angel? Guardian angel is just somebody who's come before you. That's what Nefesh is to a certain degree. Right? They are your guardian angels because they're putting on events like this to be able to help you to navigate the system. But in addition, you're also going to want to do that on an individual level, to have friends and family and people that you talk to, whether it's people in your community or people in your profession that you're going to talk to. You're going to want to reach out to those people to help you with all different steps along the way. Okay, educate yourself, educate. Everybody's here, everybody's attended this session, you'll have other sessions as well, right? Educate yourself, because the more education you get, the more you will avoid making very bad mistakes. And unfortunately, because of the language, we tend to kind of think, oh, I don't know, I don't understand, I didn't really like. No, things are available. You can get information in English. It's no longer an excuse. It's all online, right? You have everything available there. Okay, I mentioned before about tracking, especially in the first year or two. Track your income and your expenses, because you'll get a much better, clearer picture of what is really happening. Also, list your accounts and policies, all your insurance policies, life insurance and disability, etc., and all of your financial assets. List them all. Have that list available to other people, your next of kin, your family, so that you're not in a situation where you lose assets. Do you know how much money is unclaimed in the world? It's in the trillions, okay, of unclaimed assets around the world, because people die without giving over that information. And why am I mentioning Dafka now? Because when you're here, you tend to have a little bit more control. And then all of a sudden you go over there and you realize, well, I have this account over here and I forgot about this. And then there's that, and I have, accounts in multiple jurisdictions. It becomes a little bit more complicated. So do yourselves a favor, make a clear list and pay attention, right, to the small details. Okay, one of the resources that I, in terms of is my book that I wrote this book a number of years ago. We're wrapping up in 2 minutes. Yes, Financial Guide to Aliyah. So I have a couple copies here, just if you want to take a look at it. It's really out of print. And what I did instead was I put it online. So if you go to financialguidetoaliyah.com, the whole book is there for anyone who wants to be able to like learn more about all the topics that we talked about. And if you want, you can also use the barcode and you can sign up with Ariel at the back of the room for our mailing list. We generally send out once a month a newsletter about some topical news and articles that we're writing. And I'm happy to meet anyone over the course of the rest of the afternoon. We'll be at the event. I wish everyone here that really you should take advantage of your time, and it should be a successful Aliyah. Should see you on the other side of the pond. Are there any other questions before we finish? Pleasure. Any other questions? Great.